Today I will be presenting on Assemblage in Afro-Caribbean arts and identity. My passion for Caribbean and African diasporic arts began with my advisor, Professor Matt Wary, specifically his class titled Vodou in Santeria, which focuses on the islands of the West Indies, particularly Haiti and Cuba, and their respective syncretic religions, which were born from cultural blending, religious syncretism, and decades of colonial and imperial impositions. Both religions take ritual and meaning from West African Yoruba and indigenous knowledge, and believe in the power of a pantheon of spirits called to through divination, sacrifice, initiation, and mediumship. This emphasis on Yoruba roots is stronger than ever after much marginalization from the church, Caribbean governments, and misconstructions by foreigners. Both religions have a central focus on altars. Vodou means spirit or deity in the West African language. The denasalized word Vodou gives us the belief system, whose spirits are referred to as Loa in Haitian Creole, meaning law. Haitian Creole is its own language with grammatical rules and conventions, not just a dialect of French. Voodoo, as a side note, is located in the continental United States and focuses on the playful and extreme sides of Vodou, often for touristic viewership. During my work as a curatorial student assistant collaborating on the exhibition, Bodies Are Fluid, I began to research the seduction code by DC-based artist Renee Stout. Stout's work includes Vodou and fetish idols from Congo that she discovered in her local museum during her childhood. As a means to explore the realities of living in DC as a Black female artist and her spiritual journey. Though it focused on Santeria, I was able to use a theoretical framework from a paper for Professor Anna Perry's class on representations of Santeria through Puerto Rican art to analyze Stout's drawing. More than an aesthetic, assemblage, a Haitian Creole term, uses assembly, compilation, enlisting, and regrouping of ideas, things, people, and spirits to call on ancestors. And though it is a Haitian word, the theory is found across languages and borders in the Caribbean, as exemplified through my paper for Professor Perry. Assemblage is anti-colonial in its linguistic existence, too. In seduction code, Stout employs a visual assemblage of found objects, like those in Vodou altars, to create an ode to the spirits. Altars in Vodou, like in this example, are living things, as scholar Karen McCarthy Brown writes. Quote, altars happen, altars must be fed, altars must be awakened, altars breathe, end quote. They appear in the intentional, the unplanned, in the immobile, and the bodily for Vodou adherents. In the vein of the bodily, spiritual trance is an essential element in Vodou. Precipitated by sacrifices to the deities during ritual ceremonies, spirits ride initiates of Vodou, inciting dancing, singing, and prayer, a metaphor for working in the wider world in exchange for protection and favor. The sacrificial items in Stout's drawing indicate the depiction of a Zili Freda, the version of a Zili who resides in the Rada house within the larger pantheon. During a Zili Freda's spiritual visits, she flirts with and seduces people without distinguishing between sexes. Moreover, her hyperfemininity and her identifying symbols embody an aspirational femininity. As such, a Zili Freda is viewed as the patron of a special group of effeminate individuals, including gay men, trans women, and non-binary people, who have reclaimed the Haitian slur, Masisi. They often live as partners of men, taking on female gender roles, but vary in their gender identity. The phalluses which decorate Stout's lacy feminine coat are an ode to the gender playfulness and performativity found in Vodou. Moreover, these collage elements, so realistic in their rendering that one can smell the perfume offering, become a spell in their own right, one for women and queer femmes, only possible through a cultural and artistic assemblage. For Stout, too, as an African-American woman, her identity becomes a collage of race and ethnicity, layered with her experiences of spirituality and womanhood. Dr. Michelle Joan Wilkinson, curator of the exhibition titled Material Girls, Contemporary Black Women Artists, Rights of Assemblage in the Day-to-Day. Quote, generations of Black women found way to infuse their creative spirit into everyday practices. Black women crafted materials from the last desirable cuts of meat, turning out delicacies that we now consider soul food. Using the materials provided to them, Black women improvised, experimented, and in the process, invented what they needed. End quote. There are many other Caribbean artists who employ artistic assemblage to represent their multi-layered identities. New York-based artist Juan Sanchez uses Christian prayer cards and embroidery in La Lucha Continua, also at the AMAM, to depict his diasporic existence and the linguistic limbo of Spanish, and English. Similarly to Stout, photographer Amaris Carreras uses Andrea, alters, and found objects to pay homage to Puerto Rican women and gender-expansive individuals. Also, self-identifying Afro-Dominican contemporary artist Elaine Rodriguez uses textiles and beading to depict Yoruba and Vodou deities as women, centering Black, female, and gender-fluid identities in the Caribbean. At the heart of all of these artists' work is their assertion of their Blackness through religious rituals and religious assemblage, as well as cultural, linguistic, and gender layering. So, I ask you, what are the layers of your identity, and how can you celebrate those assembled identities in others? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ursula Hudak. I'm a fourth-year art history honors student. I feel privileged to be presenting alongside this group of researchers whom I consider to be my colleagues and respect. My honors thesis, Matisse, Modigliani, and Maidenform, Body of Sculpture, is focused on the examination of the two reclining nudes in the Allen's collection donated by the Bissett family. Modigliani's painting, Nude with Coral Necklace, and Matisse's pastel work, Reclining Nude. Eden and Joseph Bissett were co-founders of the Maidenform Company, which was founded in 1922 and around the production of the first modern bra made specifically to accentuate the curves of the breast. In the years following the founding of Maidenform, the Bissetts collected 24 works, which they then gave to the Allen at the advice of their nephew who had studied at Oberlin. These two pieces stood out to me as two of only 4 nudes represented in the Bissett collection and are uniquely sculptural in their reductive qualities. I asked to myself, why this pose? Why could the Bissetts have been drawn to these sculptural nudes? And how might these factors relate to the discourses of body and gender in interwar France when they were made? Both works were created in France in the pivotal period between the advent of World War I and World War II, in which a still declining birth rate, the denial of women's right to vote, and women workers greatly influenced the way women were considered, and thus the way that they were depicted, particularly in relation to the breasts. The Niles movement in France was widespread at the turn of the century, spreading propaganda such as this poster. Depictions of women at this time entailing what they could do for the war effort would usually show them in conjunction with a child, often breastfeeding. As popular dancers themselves, the Bissetts toured Europe in the early part of the 20th century and would have likely been witness to the topless dancing that was popular in the interwar period, such as at the Folies Bergerie. The ideal accentuated breasts may have been influenced by nihilist focus, increasing their idolization socially and sexually. This was opposed by the image of La Garçon, the French equivalent of the flapper. The Maidenform bra would push against their androgynous silhouette by emphasizing an explicitly curving childbearing form, underlining a push towards a new feminine ideal found in women. Both Modigliani and Matisse, though primarily known as painters, were also avid sculptors. Modigliani created several busts before he turned to painting during the war, and Matisse sculpted throughout his artistic career, creating pieces such as Large-Seated Nude, which also takes the pose of his obelisks. Though the female figure in Nude with Coral Necklace is more flat as compared to her nude, the paint is so thickly applied that her skin almost lifts off the canvas, transforming it in a way into sculpture. Further, the reductive qualities of the work's abstraction aligns the female figures in these works with other sculptures done by the artists, emphasizing their objectification so as to drive home the sexual availability of the figures, a subversive quality in a time when sex was pushed by nihilist figures to be for procreation only. These two pieces both come from a major series for each painter, Modigliani's Nudes and Matisse's Obelisks. The reclining pose of the woman in these pieces is influenced by the poses of the Italian Renaissance, as well as the French Orientalist obelisk, in which artists inserted figures of white women into the context of the harem, usually in an undressed state and reclining pose, an appropriation that further enforced their objectification. These works then underline the use of female nudes in art history as the foremost image used by artists to signify a new artistic movement. Using this pose for their nudes meant a modern reworking of a classic passive motif, perfectly timed with the recent call for women's right to vote. And further regard to natalism, these works both utilize and satirize the movement. The placing of the woman on a bed naked, separated from the child, divorces her from the motherly lens, while setting her in a position that has the visual prospect of both sexual freedom and imprisonment. Works from these series were commonly bought by famous collectors or museums. However, I believe it is more than the staple quality of these series and similar American collections that may have influenced the Bissett's, Bissett's purchase of these pieces. Based on the Bissett's exposure to topless dancers and the cultural moment of the nailist movement and the push against la garçon, I would like to argue that the sculptural aspect of the shaper and bras Maidenform manufactured, conscious or unconscious, predisposed the collectors to develop an interest in these particular sculptural paintings of nude women. Enid herself contributed to the design of the first Maidenform bra, along with Ida Rosenthal. The purchase and later donation of these two nudes in the 1950s coincided with the rollout of Maidenform's famous I Dreamed ad campaign. Some of these ads seem to suggest an explicit understanding of the sculptural aspect. Most notably, I dreamed I was Venus de Milo in my Maidenform bra. With the use of the Maidenform bra and shapewear, women could conform to this sculptural and explicitly fertile idea of feminine beauty. Very little is recorded about the Bissetts, unfortunately, and we do not know if the purchase of the art in the collection was shared between them or decided by one or the other. Nonetheless, the speculative line of thinking and the context I provided for it gives us a glimpse into the often overlooked connections between production, gender, art collection, and the subject matter of some of the most iconic works of modern art. Thank you.
I'm Parker Niles, and I've been a gallery guide at the Allen for 2 years now, which means that I've gotten to know the galleries pretty well during my time on tours, working at the front desk, and general wandering around. This one case in the Asian ambulatory kept catching my attention and has been a favorite of mine because of my interest in Himalayan art. From just a show of hands, has anyone seen this case before? Great. Now, is anyone confident that they know what these are? Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. With some knowledge of Buddhist iconography, some of these figures can be identified as different deities like Vajrapani, right, and Padmapani on the left. They are Himalayan statues from Tibet and Nepal, ranging from the 13th to the 16th centuries. At this point in time, it's not important that you know exactly who they are, but I'll get into their actual function. With my previous scholarly experience with Tibetan Buddhism, I knew that these statues were important ritual objects to Buddhist practice and were oftentimes consecrated, being made animate through a series of material and ritual transformations. Examples of the type of objects that would have been involved in the consecration process can be seen on the screen. The statues would have been filled with mantras, small relics, meaning remnants of a holy person, or smaller statues and other objects. However, how can the average visitor understand what I've just told you through the objects with this lack of context presented in the museum? It's important to note that these kind of labels are quite common in the museum, and it's not uncommon for some objects to be without interpretation. With these objects in a simple case, with the accompanying label describing some common features of Buddhist iconography, the visitor can come to understand the beauty of these objects, yes, perhaps identify the figure, but how can they understand the wealth of history behind these objects, the amount of devotional care and the mastery of Buddhist iconometry and ritual practice? The question I had was, if these statues were, if not now, once considered animate, how should a museum be treating this type of object? What current approaches are museums taking with Buddhist objects? This is both in how they are regarded with respect to their sacred nature and how this is presented to visitors. How is the sacred given consideration in the museum itself, and how is it talked about more publicly? My senior capstone project in religion, launching off of these Himalayan statues at the Allen, sought to understand the current situation of Buddhist sacred objects in Western museums, understanding the museum as a place that creates, shapes, and erases meaning from its collection, while delving into Tibetan Buddhist ritual and philosophy of consecration, as well as a history of Tibetan Buddhist art in Western museums. Arguing that museums often lack consideration of Tibetan Buddhist frameworks regarding animate statues, this paper suggested frameworks for an anthropological understanding of Buddhist animacy and explores how these institutions could utilize the concept of what I've appropriated as third spaces to represent and discuss the different worlds sacred objects occupy. With help from curator of Asian art Kevin Greenwood and chief preparator Andrzej Sapavik, we were able to physically handle and examine the objects to find out if they had been consecrated at one point or another. This consecration is often indicated by the Vajra symbol that can be found underneath the statue. The Vajra can be seen in the middle here of Padmapani, and this Vajra can be seen here in the middle of the crown Buddha. These two Vajra symbols are different because Padmapani comes from Nepal and the crown Buddha comes from this one comes from Tibet and this one comes from Nepal. This was one of the only first steps in the project. I then went off to consult other researchers who had done translations of Tibetan Buddhist consecration manuals, like Yal Bentor, and other anthropologists working with concepts of material agency, like Joyce Flukiger and Amy Whitehead, to see what they had to say about relationality with material objects. While exploring how different museums display Buddhist objects, in formalist or, as you see on the screen, more ethnographic displays, I found a variety of display methods, like those that use multisensory techniques to bring viewers into a more authentic shrine experience with light, sound, smell, and decor. In the end, the recommendation I gave to the museum was to have more interpretation that presents the objects in their multiple dimensions. As art objects exemplary of Himalayan and Buddhist art, as political pieces of cultural property, and as sacred objects with potential for personhood and animacy. This could be achieved through wall labels, QR codes, or other tech-savvy ways of giving the visitor all the information, rather than displaying them in a shrine display. Thankfully, through my work in the capstone, I've been connecting with Kevin Greenwood about the upcoming reinstallation of the Asian Ambulatory that highlights issues of provenance history and sacred context when it comes to Asian art. I'm glad that the Allen is choosing to change the way that they display Asian objects, and I hope it gets the public talking and thinking about these issues. I hope that this project contributes to conversations around Buddhist sacred objects in museums, how to properly respect and represent the sacred, and how to contextualize artifacts in the museum in general, while leaving room for original context and traditional knowledge. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Cecil, and today I'm going to introduce Haring and briefly discuss one of his works in the Allen's collection, Autograph Card, and raise questions about the shifting identity of the card and Haring's autograph as a commemorative object, a work of art, and a relic of Haring's identity as a contemporary martyr of the art world. Haring was an American pop artist best known for his bold line art style and recognizable icons such as the Radiant Baby. His public career began in the early 80s, and over the span of a decade, Haring's art had spread around the world through paintings, sculptures, and a seemingly endless variety of merchandise, like my shirt. He was raised Christian, and although he was not practicing as an adult, Christian themes and imagery remained prominent in his work throughout his entire career. And interestingly, Christianized ideas of martyrdom and sainthood have influenced how Haring and his art is remembered today. After his death from AIDS in 1990, Haring was uplifted by art critics because of his passion about public access to art and social activism, elevating him to the status of a martyr figure. Haring was also very much an artistic celebrity during his life, traveling the world and signing countless autographs. One such autograph is now in the Allen's collection, a signed card from the collection of the late Helen Kovach Gilderman. On the card, Haring signs his name, the date, and includes a small drawing. Normally, an object like this one would be held in an archive. In fact, as far as I know, the rest of Miss Gildzen's collection is now in the archives at Kent State. But the Allen was given and keeps Haring's card, effectively giving this object a new identity as a work of art. Arguably, this may be due to the small doodle Haring included on the card, or perhaps some kind of collecting technicality. But rather than speculating on why the card made it into the collection to begin with, I found myself much more interested in using this object as a focal point in my research to unpack how Haring's signature plays a visual and tangible part in his martyred identity. When Haring signed the card in 1986, he transformed an everyday piece of paper into something valuable, something worth collecting. Haring's signature plays a crucial role in this transformation. The name, stylized on the card as K. Haring, has the power of identity and association. It makes this card a record that says Keith Haring was here. Notably, the signature on this card follows the conventions of how Haring usually signs his name on his works of art. I've included another example here so you can see the similarities. This example is particularly interesting as it is an addition that Haring signed himself, rather than have his signature reproduced. The visual consistency suggests a consistency in the way that Haring thought about signing his name and leaving his mark behind, regardless of where he did it. His name is equally as important as the line work or the drawing itself. Both will long outlive him. Keeping this idea of legacy and what gets left behind in mind, I want to now tie the autograph card to Christian relics. A relic objects can take many forms, not just preserved body parts. Many relics also contain written records of what they are, such as the patent and the bundled relics on the left here, and are kept today in art museums. They were objects originally imbued with importance, value, and power because they are part of or have made contact with some kind of holy figure like a saint. There is a similar relic-like power in the autograph card. It has been touched and signed by Haring. It preserves and makes important his identity and his work. I briefly introduced this idea of a relic here, not to try and decipher whether all signed art or things are relics, but to exemplify how my larger project examines how the way we think about art objects and artistic legacy fundamentally relates to and is based in Christianized concepts. In introducing this topic, I teased the idea that Haring was, in his own contemporary way, a holy saint or martyr figure. Having examined this autograph card, we can begin to see how much Haring cared about his image as an artist and a person, and his desire for evidence of his presence that outlived him and proved he was a prolific and masterful artist. I hope that in this limited time, I have been able to shed some new perspective on this interesting object, as well as Haring himself. I look forward to sharing more about my project, and a brief thank you to all of my mentors, including Professor Christina Nielsen and Sam Adams, as well as the other awesome folks on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really so happy to have the opportunity to share my work with all of you and to speak alongside all these incredibly talented scholars. First, I want to thank my honors advisor, Professor Christina Nielsen, for her constant support and guidance as I was conducting this research. I also want to thank Professor Eric Ingalls and Professor Wendy Hyman for their invaluable advice during my writing process. So this year, I wrote a thesis about Francesco Bertos, a little-known sculptor who worked in 17th and 18th century Venice. In the early 18th century, Francesco Bertos was brought before the Inquisition. He was accused of invoking demons in order to create his sculptures. So my research looks closely at Bertos' work and attempts to understand this episode of his life. So the Allen has a work by Bertos in its collection, The Fall of Icarus. And as you can see here, Bertos' work is immediately striking for its sense of movement and suspension. They are technical marvels, which use as few supports as possible to keep their acrobatic figures in place and give the impression of total weightlessness. For a long time, scholars believed that this was the only thing noteworthy about Bertos' work, that his sculptures were meant to be enjoyed as displays of pure technical prowess, often without any meaning at all. Catherine J. Watson, who was a curator of the Allen in the 70s, was one of the earliest scholars to note another essential element of Bertos' work, his intriguing use of compositional design, through which he cleverly manipulates angles and perspective. She writes, The fall of Icarus was made to be enjoyed for the ever-changing patterns of limbs and drapery that occur with the rotation of the bronze. Each new angle reveals something unsuspected. For instance, the river god's face becomes fully visible from only one point. Here, when she talks about the river god, she's talking about this figure here. And you see his face is only visible from one point, one that totally blocks out the head of it. In effect, something is always hidden. I'd like to point out something else about this sculpture and the way Bertos manipulates angles. The cherub you see here, standing near this figure's leg, seems to function as a support. In fact, there are very few angles in which you can clearly see that those two figures are separate. The male figure is freestanding, and he is balancing on tiptoe, supporting the weight of both himself and Icarus by a single point. Now, this is very technically difficult, and the marvel of it is heightened by the way Bertos conceals it, putting the cherub so close to the standing figure that it surprises you when a new angle reveals their separation. So in order to create a work like this, you would first make a model of the figures in wax. This is just to sort of demonstrate the process. So you see here, this is the wax figure, and then you would encase the wax figure in a mold, heat it so that the wax runs out and then fill that space in the mold with molten bronze. This gives the process its name, lost wax casting. So Bertos uses melting wax to depict a myth about melting wax. If you know the myth of Icarus, you know that his father, Daedalus, was a genius craftsman who constructed Icarus' wings from feathers and wax, but the wax melted when Icarus flew too close to the sun. You may not know, and I didn't know this when I started this research, that Daedalus was imagined not just as a craftsman, but specifically as a sculptor. His sculptures were said to be so lifelike that they could move and speak, and they had to be tied down or they might walk away. Bertos seems to draw a parallel between himself and Daedalus. In constructing this gravity-defying sculpture, he repeated the way Daedalus used wax to push the limits of human ability. This is an aspect of Bertos' work that I explore in my thesis, his use of self-reference and meta-commentary on the art of sculpture itself. In fact, I believe that this work can be read as a kind of self-portrait, examining the idea of the sculptor. In the Allen's bronze, Bertos shows a plunging Icarus, his waxen wings tattered and in pieces. Like Daedalus, Bertos tests the limits of suspension. But while the wax wings failed and the mythological Icarus fell, Bertos' Icarus remains permanently, impossibly suspended. Icarus' fall then undoes itself, pulling apart the very fabric of the myth through the act of representing it. Bertos' fall of Icarus then looks inward at its own creation, flaunting how it pushes the boundaries of its medium. Now, unfortunately, like Icarus, Bertos' boundary pushing also led to a really devastating fall. In the 1730s, Francesco Bertos was brought before the Inquisition. His works were apparently too technically masterful to have been made by mere human hands and must have been achieved through demonic intercession. Interestingly, the two works that sparked this accusation before the Inquisition also contain a similar kind of self-reference. Their subjects were sculpture, arithmetic, and architecture, and painting and music, and they made intriguing meta-commentary on the act of artistic creation, while also seeming to transcend the limitations of sculpture as a medium. Bertos was exonerated, but his works still have the power to confound, amaze, and trouble us to this day. Thanks.
Hello, I am Zimmerman, a fourth-year archaeological studies major, and today I will be presenting on the work I did for my senior project. So I researched these 7 items, all of which are in the Allen's collection. There was very little information recorded about them when I first started my project. So the first step of my research was to more accurately identify what these items are and what tribe they might be from. I did this through visual comparison of these items to similar ones in more well-documented museum collections. I determined that they were all likely of Cheyenne origin because of the predominantly white background and prominence of triangular designs. As for what the items are, I was able to identify this first item over here as a whetstone case used to hold a whetstone for sharpening knives. The next two items, this one and this one, as well as the one over here, are all stripe-light pouches, which are used to carry fire starters. The small red one in the middle is a ration ticket pouch, which was developed later as a variation on the strike-a-light pouch to carry around ration tickets, which is how people got food on reservations. The two long skinny items are awl cases used to carry an awl, which was used for a variety of tasks, but most notably beadwork and leatherwork. These findings were confirmed during a consultation with Hunter Old Elk, assistant curator at the Plains Indian Museum in Cody, Wyoming, and member of Apsalika and Yakama nations. She also helped more accurately date the creation of these items to between 1880 and 1910. Now confident in the culture of origin, time period, and specific types of items, I began researching more about how these items were made and their use and meaning in their source context. Essentially, these were carried by women to hold everyday items they would need easy access to. They would be worn tied to a belt, as you can see in the image on the lower left. And I have attempted to emulate this in the layout of the slide. So arranging the items as if they are all hanging next to each other like they would on a belt. Beadwork was a craft practiced solely by women across the plains and used to beautify all sorts of things, both sacred and mundane. These items are the latter, so their designs were entirely up to the whims of their creators. If they had any significance, it was personal and now lost to time. So why did I have to do all this work just to learn what these items are and where they are from? To answer this question, I need to provide a very brief history of Native American ethnographic items in museums. Hopefully, all of you are already aware of the history of how the United States has treated its indigenous occupants, specifically the genocide and erasure of Native cultures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through forced relocation, war, and boarding schools. During this time, anthropologists attempted to preserve these disappearing cultures by taking their items in a practice known as salvage anthropology, often neglecting to record specifics of where the items were collected or even what they were. These anthropologists then displayed the items in museums in ways that portrayed Native American cultures as primitive, savage, and remnants of the past. So how does the Allen fit into this history? Unfortunately, we do not have records showing where these items are from or how they got to Oberlin. But based on when they are made, they were likely collected during the time of salvage anthropology, which would account for the lack of recorded information about them. Now, considering this broader history of Native Americans in museums, I believe that all museums stewarding Native American ethnographic items, including the Allen, have an obligation to work towards repairing past and ongoing harm by restoring agency over items to the source communities. This can be done by developing long-term relationships with tribal representatives, empowering source communities to use the items in ways that best serve them, whether that be returning the item to the source community or keeping it in a museum. And if the community wants the items to remain in a museum, curators should work in service of communities in the curation of collections and development of exhibits. Many major museums are already making progress in this direction, including the Field Museum in Chicago and the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. However, the process looks much different for those museums, which have massive collections and a host of staff specializing in those areas, than it would here at the Allen. Since these differences mean the Allen can't simply follow the blueprint set by these larger museums, what are concrete next steps the Allen can take to start moving in this direction? First and easiest would be to update the name, date, and culture of origin of the items I have researched in the database. But more importantly and more difficult is the process of beginning to reach out to Cheyenne tribal organizations to arrange a consultation with a representative who can tell us more about the items and potentially identify more specific source communities. Through this, we can begin establishing relationships with identified source communities to pursue future collaborative efforts, including possible repatriation. I want to make it clear that I am not advocating for blanket repatriation. I believe that it should be up to the source communities to decide where the items should be and how they should be used. There are many reasons why a community might want these items back, but there are also many reasons why an Indigenous community would want these items to stay in a museum. Either way, it is their choice to make, not ours. And finally, as this process is going on, students should continue this research for the other Native American ethnographic items in the collection. The more we can find out on our own, the easier it will be to take the next steps towards collaboration. Thank you.